morning, faith in the midst of it all. And then in the second service, Sister Pam came in and she said, from the book of Esther, she said, but preparation is key. Because we look good in here this morning, ladies. I just want to say that. We look good. But preparation is more than on the outside, but being prepared on the inside. And then Sister Barker came with that amazing obedience. In the midst of it all, be obedience, because Lord knows I'm the sister right here who does what I want. Lord, help me. Help me. Help me, Lord. And then Jazz came with that sweet testimony. Just sitting here, I had to think about the goodness of the Lord, and I thought about my story, and it's so amazing that it's funny, you grow up and you think like, Lord, I'm the only person who ever felt like I didn't belong or felt like the structure of my family was all messed up. But when you find that you have sisters who are connected with one another, who can come alongside you and say, no, I have some of the similar stories, and we both here in the same place at the same time. And I believe that God called us here for such a time as this. And the title that I came with is In the Midst of It All, Love. Love. Sister Pam was all in my, I was reading Esther 2 also, Sister Pam. I said, Lord, I can't catch a break. But it's funny because the scripture I'm going to come from is Esther 4:14. And it says, for if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. You may be seated. I just want to say thank you to Sister Rebecca and everyone. I see the name change on the program. I'll talk about that later.
That's all right.
So in the midst, I thought, yes, that sounds good. Mr. Keys, is that all right? In the midst of it all, love. And I thought, I think it's so profound for me because I feel like I'm in a season of love. And, but in the midst of what's going on all around us, how can we talk about love, really? What's going on right now is crazy. We have the pandemic going on. Sadly, the fatal police shootings has increased. Breonna Taylor, police murdered her in her home. Just this past week, George Floyd murdered in front of everybody, in front of the camera. How can we love in the midst of what's going on? Many of our brown and black fathers, our uncles, our nephews, and our sons are being taken away from us early because of a system that's been systematically created to make some win and some lose. Yes. And I'm still trying to figure out, if we're all under the same constitution, why is it that some receive the freedom and the liberties and others are held behind and asked to pull us up by our own bootstraps?
Yeah. Wow. Right.
Good. Strong.
But in the midst of it all, love. Why? Why love? In the midst of us being taken advantage of, in the midst of a system that's taking advantage of us, in a world that is really, it seems like it's two separate worlds in one world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or we're in one America, but it's two Americas existing inside of one. And it's like with all the rage and with all the anxiety and mostly with all the hurt and the pain and just trying to figure this thing out, because we're living in crazy times. If there was ever a time to love, it is now.
Amen.
Where's our churches at in the midst of this pandemic? Some of our churches have compromised. And I believe that God has called the church to be the divine institution here on earth. to give him glory. But where are we in these times of crises, in these times of difficult conversations, or this time of a lot of hurt and anger that's being misplaced? But where are our leaders in some of our churches? And I want to say, give a shout out to Midtown, because I know my church is a praying church. We on the scene. We pray on site. We doing all of that. So in the midst of economic crisis, in the midst of Americans dealing with healthcare, the healthcare system, our criminal justice system, our families, I believe in the midst of it all, God is still calling us to love. The book of Esther is parallel to us today to help us see that God's sovereignty and his loving care for his people. However, it is filled with a lot of drama, power, and romance. If you ever go and read it, you'll see that it's dealing with a whole lot of stuff similar to today. So my first point is this: in the midst of it all, love provides the possibility of change.
Wow.
See, the story is about a Hebrew woman in Persia known as Esther, who saves the genocides of her people. God prepared the place and the opportunity, and his people, Esther and Mordecai, chose to act. And so I just want to talk about that for a moment, that Queen Esther background wasn't squeaky clean. You know, I want to talk about Mordecai for a second. Mordecai helps us see the opportunities we have when our men are in place.
Come on.
Without Mordecai, Esther doesn't exist. Without Mordecai, Esther doesn't have the opportunity to be put in a position to help not only herself, but to help a whole group of people that's in desperate need, because there's a hater on the loose by the name of Haman who's wreaking havoc because he's mad at Mordecai because Mordecai refuses to bow to him because he doesn't worship the same God. And at this point in the text, Mordecai represents God because he's a Jew. And anytime they talked about Jews back then, it was a representation of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. And so you don't have Esther if you don't have Mordecai.
Okay.
And the thing about Mordecai is, if you read the history of Mordecai, Mordecai had his own challenges with life. But he turned in a tragic opportunity to take in when his uncle died, to take in his little cousin as a daughter. So in that point, I want to say, thank God for the men, and thank God for them because they are essential. Because remember, Esther learns how to present herself, how to be prepared, and how to prosper in a place that she's never been before.
Say that. Yes.
So I want to encourage you, in the midst of it all, we can trust God to weave together in uncertain events for our best. And even though we may not see it, God is working in the midst.
Amen.
My second point, in the midst of it all, love lifted us.
Okay.
I believe the book of Esther is filled with divine interventions, God behind the scenes of Esther. In this book, God's name is not mentioned one time, but you can see how God manipulated situations and intervened in situations that was crazy. You couldn't really believe it. And I thought, when I was studying this, I thought one of the things that was interesting also is that I believe I see now why God's name wasn't mentioned in this particular book, because in that time they had so many different gods. Like they were worshiping all kind of gods, calling on other gods. That was a way that they controlled the people, right? And so here you have this book, and you have this story or this drama that's happening, and God's name is never mentioned. And I think that was key for me because when I started to think about my life, and as you think about your life, you can see situations how God just divinely intervened and made magic where you thought there couldn't be any magic. And finding love in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of uncertain times.
Preach.
If you are a believer, we serve the same God with one Spirit. In 1 Corinthians 12:4-6, it says, there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are differences of ministries, but the same Lord. And there are diversities of activities, but it is the same God who works all in all. But the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all. It's saying like what's going on today in the world. We're all different, but we're of one Spirit. If you're a believer and true believer, we function in one Spirit. We may have different gifts. Some may be teachers, some may be speakers, some may be psalmists, some may be just regular church believers and love God and just doing their own thing behind the scenes. But we're all on one accord, moving as one. And I think it's so interesting because when Esther found favor with the king. Instantly. And Sister Pam, when you were talking about the preparation, one of the things that stood out was when they asked the ladies, well, take whatever you want. Esther took nothing but what he recommended. And she was going to a place that she never been to before. And so I thought like in this moment of love, and I was thinking about my own life, like I could remember the first time I met Mr. Keys, it was after church, and I was going to a business meeting, and I was late because I was coming out of finance. So I was like, Lord, this is a bad look. You already know what color I am, Lord. I'm just looking bad. And then I remember pulling up to the house, and I remember saying these exact words. I had sat back, and I was like, Lord, like I don't want to be distracted. I was like, don't distract me. I was like, Lord, I want to stay focused. Like, I'm really gun-ho now. Like, Crowns is looking good. I left church. I'm motivated and I'm focused, And I walked to the house where we were having the business meeting, and one of my business partners was sitting there, and I saw Marcus. So when I was reading this story, I couldn't help but to think about like, oh my God, I could imagine what Esther was thinking, at this moment, because in the midst of it all, like I believe that God works things out and gives you what you need, because in the text, Esther never revealed that she was a Jew. And I believe when Mordecai asked her to not reveal, who she was, it was because Haman had already set the decree to kill all Jews, that she may have not made it to purpose. Because the purpose for her was to be in the king's palace, to be able to be put in a position to save a whole group of people that could never be saved if she never enters the king's palace. And so I thought about it. I was like, wow, Lord, like my whole life I always felt like my story was so crazy, people would never believe what I'm saying. Or I should look like I'm going crazy. But like Sister said earlier, there's always a time and a place. And when it was time, I really felt like, wow, this is it. And I also learned by reading in the text how the king favored Esther and how she approached him. And it was a process in how she approached the king. And I was also reading that it said she could pretty much say whatever. She had half of the kingdom, power and authority, just by being associated or just by being married to the king. And I thought that was, for me, I'm thinking like, oh, that's good. I think I'm in the right spot, because now I know how to approach the king
All right.
and get my way, but not get my way like, geez, not get my way like a little bit. I just want a little bit. But honestly, I believe my last point is, in the midst of it all, love restored. And that's just really what happened in the book of Esther. God restored. He not only restored them, and this is how he restored them, by Esther bravely standing up, because believe me, I believe it was not an easy task to stand before a king. And back then, in those days, you could risk getting killed. Like, how bad do you really want to? I done made it, right? But I honestly believe that Esther knew, like, deep in her heart, like, I made it through so much. And what if we come to this time for such a time as this? And she made up in her mind, if I perish, let me perish. And I believe that's what God is calling us to do today. If I perish, let me perish. But I'm going to do what Esther did. I'm going to fast and pray. And in the midst of it all, do it in love. I believe the Lord is calling us to love, because I was reading the other day, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, I like to call him Reverend, because I love his story. I feel like he was anointed for his position, and they say doctor, but I believe that he was sent by God. And one of the things he said was, hate can't drive out hate, only love can do that. And I believe that the world is in need of love.
Amen.
Love in the midst of it all. Love in the midst of the hate. Love in the midst of the unfairness that's been given to some, and privilege that's been granted for others. And love in the midst, because I believe that God will divinely show up, even if they never mention his name in our government, even if the president never acknowledged him, even if our senators and other churches never mention God's name. But God is always in the midst, and he shows us that through the book of Esther. So I just want you guys to be encouraged that in the midst of it all, love.
Amen.